second row, sorry. You've identified one of the major challenges in California as being a lack of centrism and moderation in the legislature. And even if we have redistricting that, adds some more diversity, it's not clear that will provide necessarily, major changes. What are other solutions that you see could solve some of the challenges that we see?
Well, I really do think that redistricting combined with an open primary will be a great help. Again, not because centrists or moderates are inherently superior to liberals or conservatives, but just because it creates, I think, a more cohesive working environment. Dan Schnur's wish list, if I ran the world, I have to stick to politics on this one, otherwise I could be here for a while. I would expand the size of the legislature. And I realize that given a population that is predisposed to not like politicians well, would not be all that excited about having more. But if you look at the amount of the size of the constituency that members of the state assembly and certainly the state senate have to represent, it's ludicrously out of whack with the idea of representative democracy. A state senator represents almost 1 million people. And I don't know about you, but having a town meeting with 1 million people just sounds unwieldy. When I worked in presidential politics many years ago, my first job out of college was for George Bush Sr., or as we now call him, Bush Classic. And I was working on this campaign in 1987. We were spending most of our time in the state of New Hampshire. The state of New Hampshire is a state legislature, state assembly of like 300 people. We're a state that is a tiny fraction of ours. And for all sorts of other reasons that New Hampshire and Iowa ought to retain their places in the presidential nomination process, and I'll get into that today. But I noticed, what I saw with the state legislature, where the individual members represented smaller constituencies, is how much more smoothly government could function. Because members, again, for other reasons than those I mentioned earlier, were able to be responsive to their members, not just through public opinion polling, not just through television advertising and direct mail, not just through organized interest groups, but they were actually able to get to know a sizable portion of their communities. So I dramatically expanded the size of the state legislature. Although I only agree with Harold Meyerson once every 46 years or so, I agree with at least one part of his op-ed in this morning's Times about the idea of a unicameral legislature. In other words, if you're going to expand the number of state legislators that to such a great degree, it doesn't seem to make sense to have a state senator representing exactly the same people that two state assembly members are. So I grow the number of legislators, go with the unicameral legislature. I have to say I am personally torn on the idea of a part-time legislature, because I recognize if you have several hundred people in a California state legislature, the expense of that gets pretty significant. I recognize that these jobs are complicated. I also recognize how much time the state legislature and governor of either party can waste and do waste every year when they set their mind to it. And I like the idea of limiting the amount of time that legislators spend in Sacramento, because I think it's very easy for members to lose touch with their constituencies. Here's the thing to know. If there's anyone else in the room aside from the gentleman in back who's thinking about running for state legislature, here's one thing to know about the state legislature. When you are in Sacramento, you are treated like a god. Journalists, lobbyists, staffers just genuflect you. It's a pretty good feeling. And when you come back to your district, nobody knows who you are. You stand in the parking lot outside the shop, outside the grocery store, begging people to give you 30 seconds of their time at your card table, and most of them won't. So think about it. If you're a normal person, would you rather be defeated? Would you rather be idolized up in Sacramento by all these rich, important people who, by the way, take you to basketball games and take you to dinner and give you money? Or do you rather come back to your district and beg people to listen to you who probably aren't going to anyway? There are downsides of a part-time legislature, particularly, I think, the professional makeup of the people who were involved. But I think forcing our members to spend more time with the people who elected them rather than those who are imposing the kind of influences that Kathy was talking about earlier would be a good thing. So, part-time legislature, largest legislature, unicameral legislature. As I mentioned earlier, I do think redistricting to open primary help. That's political reform. And man, if you want to get into government reform, get comfortable because we probably have to do a telethon.
Assuming that you were to do all these things and that people would, California voters would reinvest themselves in the political process, have more confidence in the state legislature and whatnot, how would you prevent the voters from basically, well, not to put a fine point on it, but screwing themselves? Right now, we have the initiative process. Whenever the legislature is uncomfortable voting on something, they duck. Or somebody else comes up with an initiative. What are the implications for the initiative process? And I guess what should be the implications for the initiative process?
Well, I think what should be the implications and what can be the implications are two very different things. Because if voters like term limits, man, do they love the initiative process, and frankly, you can't blame them. Or more accurately, you can't blame us. But I think while most people would agree that while legislation is a scalpel, the initiative is a sledgehammer, a frustrated group of voters like to have that last resort of going to the sledgehammer. Now, whether you think the initiative process works well or not, like I was saying earlier about the 2/3 vote, depends entirely on what's on the ballot and what recently has been. If you are a supporter of same-sex marriage in California, you have every right to think that the initiative process is out of control. If you think, however, that guaranteed funding for K-12 education is a good thing, then you think the initiative process is just fine. So people hate the initiative process unless something they want is on the ballot. And I think it does create an important, not necessarily a prod for the legislature, but a court of last resort, if you will. If a state legislature, members of both parties, can't or won't address a significant public policy problem because of the interest influences that Kathy was talking about earlier, I think giving some recourse to the voters is a good idea. One reform that I think would be a good idea, would be uphill but at least achievable, potentially achievable, is, and Bob will tell me the formal name of it because I can't do it. Indirect initiative, which essentially gives the legislature, once an initiative has qualified for the ballot, gives the legislature one last shot at it. And say, okay, Dan Schnur and his friends have collected enough signatures to pass an initiative to make Schnur king. And I have the signatures for it.
They're all false.
Yeah, exactly. They're all false. Well, all but one. The legislature would get one more chance at that, and they could fix any legal problems in it, but they could also offer substantive reforms. And as long as the sponsor of the initiative was amenable to those changes, it'd be much easier to come to a compromise. I'll give you my example.